Hello, everyone. We would like to discuss an interesting topic that usually is not uh, getting very much attention, according to my opinion. That's the occupation of the Ruhr region in 1923-1925 by French and Belgian armies as a retaliation, as a reaction to non-payment of the payment that Germany was supposed to pay.
That sum would have to be paid in goods as well as money. Most would come from here in the Ruhr, the industrial heart of Germany. But at the end of 1922, the Germans fell behind with their payments, and Raymond Poincaré, the new French Prime Minister, decided to act. If Germany wouldn't pay in full and on the nail, then France would help herself.
The interesting issue is whether it have actually added to the worsening situation before the Nazi Party in the beginning of the 30s succeeded to gain the power, and whether it was an important factor or it would be just a speculation to think that this decision was made and had an impact. We would like also to make a generalization. What kind of strategies towards the defeated enemy are useful and which are counterproductive? It's like how much you would like to humiliate and suppress the enemy before you actually get the counter reaction that can cost you dearly. Here we will discuss whether it really have the impact or not. Also, we would like to make a connection between the period when there was a appeasement of Germans before the start of the Second World War, when there was a meeting in Munich and a decision to let them occupy Czechoslovakia, and silent war after the beginning of the Poland occupation of Poland, like 6 months of not doing anything on the West, letting Germans to proceed with full occupation of Poland, and then division of Poland with Russians, and then proceeding to the West. Probably some measures could have been an obstacle for Germans at the early stages when they were dealing with the war in Poland, if the United Armies could influence the situation from the West and not waiting what's going to happen. And about the appeasement, like trying to appease the aggressor. In the early 20s, it was an opposite situation. It's like was provoking the aggressor, like provoking the nation that was engaged in the First World War to be in a very negative way, treated in their social conscience the winners of the war, and how this mistake probably was overcome after the Second World War, when the Germany actually successfully rebuilt itself on both sides, the Western Germany and Eastern Germany, and the feeling that was left in the common atmosphere is shame about the Second World War and no revisionism, right? So those are the issues that we would like to talk over with the historian from Montreal, that I will let him to introduce himself. And I hope it will be very interesting. Yeah.
That's a very eloquent introduction. Yeah, so my name is Ariel, and like was mentioned, I'm a historian from Montreal. And just to get into that issue, it is a very interesting topic, you know, in terms of what were the effects of the Ruhr occupation. And I think, I mean, you covered very general kind of parts of that part, which is great. But I think everybody kind of needs to give some credit to kind of the backgrounds of the Ruhr occupation and World War II. If we look, quite evidently, the World War I, that would be, in my opinion anyways, kind of the period where you can really, post-World War I, you can see a lot of the psychology internationally change drastically. Keep in mind, World War I was something that had no precedence. There was no precedent of a war between all countries. And the scale of this war was also unprecedented. There were millions and millions of deaths. New technologies existed that were able to kill much faster, much more efficiently. So in that context, that's kind of where what we call the interwars period. The years between World War I and World War II, these years were very, very precarious years. You know, in many ways, Germany instigated World War I, and there had to be an example that had to be showed. You know, the world couldn't accept the fact that a country can start a war around the world. There needed to be some kind of example that needed to be made, which is ironic because when the Allies won the Allies won World War I, there's a lot of discussion about how severe should the punishments be. If I'm not mistaken, there was one of the American president actually who had he had mentioned that the severity of the consequences after the Treaty of Versailles, after World War I, is going to come back against us, meaning if we go too severe, this can end up being countereffective, which is basically what happened. But it is a very tricky situation because in the same time, you needed to show an example. Germany had to be punished. They had to serve as an example for the whole world to see that you can't do what you did.
So, on the 11th of January 1923, French and Belgian troops entered the Ruhr to force the Germans to pay up. There was, of course, after Versailles, no German army big enough to stop them. At first, the French believed that they could make the Germans work for them. But suddenly, German politicians and people were united in a common cause, hatred of the French, and huge protest meetings were held all over Germany. Workers in the Ruhr refused to cooperate with the enemy, and the German government supported the strikers. Germany's industrial heart stopped beating, and the goods trains which should have been carrying German wealth to France lay idle in the sidings. The French hit back by bringing in their own workers to get things moving again. Their attitude towards the Germans in the Ruhr began to harden. They tried to cut the Ruhr off from the rest of the country. German visitors were searched as if they were entering a foreign land. They deported the leaders of the passive resistance, German officials, and even the police.
But then what we saw is, as you mentioned earlier, we saw how that actually backfired. And the Ruhr occupation, just some background to that, for those who don't know, essentially Germany was not really able to finance the reparations that they were imposed on for the damages that they done. Basically, World War I, a lot of the war happened in France. Many areas of France were completely destroyed. Many areas in Europe were destroyed. Somebody had to pay for these damages. The natural, solution was Germany had to repay the damages that it did.
May I ask? I ask you.
Yeah.
You naturally blame the First World War to Germans. It
Yeah,
wasn't that obvious as it was the Second World War, isn't it?
it was nuts. And you're right, there was a lot more, um, it was a lot more subtle. You know, World War One didn't have a clear political ideology. There was no clear evidence of an intent. It was,
What did they want to accomplish? It's not clear for
well,
neither sides.
mhm. Two parts. First of all, you know, as we all know, history is written by the victor, meaning if the Allies won, they had to impose, you know, what their idea was of justice, and vice versa. If the other side would have won, another kind of example of justice would have won. It just so happened that the Allied won. Whether Germany was the instigator or whether Germany was the culprit in World War One, at that point, it's irrelevant. You know, there's a lot of speculation, and this is, it stays speculation. There's no facts to show the intent of Germany.
When
You
we're
know,
talking about the punishment, we cannot talk about the punishment without actually aiming to blame the cause of the war on Germany, and still it is not clear. It is not clear. It like if we investigate the reasons for the First World War, that wouldn't be like a global ideology like Nazis have, or global ideology like communists have.
to some
It
extent,
would be for each country would be some kind of local interests here and there, gaining some territory, gaining some better economic goodies here and there. And they would be different probably. For Russia, uh, again, it was not very clear either what they wanted to reach. Um,
well, there was one thing that was clear, and it was clearly motivated for imperialism. You know, it was clearly the race for imperialism started even before. You know, by
but
19.
they were not aiming to destroy or occupy completely the countries. And as we can see with Germany, they didn't occupy the Germany, didn't divide it like we did it after the Second World War.
Mhm.
And when you say it was completely unprecedented, but there were some examples of the wars before, like in 1870s, when the Bismarck and German army even got Napoleon III captured, and they were trying to take over Paris, right?
Mhm.
And they definitely won the war, but the results were they didn't occupy the country, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
So Crimean War, for example, it was a predecessor of the global war too, because it was run in different locations in Black Sea, in the North, in the Baltic Sea as well.
Mhm.
And the number of the countries that were involved was substantial, not as substantial as the either First or Second World War, of course, but the tendency was definitely there to form the alliances and go to war together when the group of countries is opposing another group of countries.
So if I asked you to what end?
Yeah, well, back then, again, that's like I wouldn't say it really strategic changes in the world. That would be not letting one of the powers to get too much power, I guess. Like the Crimean War probably was about Russia getting too powerful to contain this power.
Mhm.
The Germans and French, again, um, yeah,
There was a lot of
Regency.
evidence in you know, in the 1900s. By the way, this is a fact. By the early 1900s, there was literally not a single area that was not colonized in the world. we're talking all of Africa, we're talking all of Australia, everything.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, it's a war. If you win the war, you can take the colonies. You can exchange the colonies.
Essentially, there were elements of tension between many countries before World War I that kind of demonstrated kind of a snip in the future kind of example. There were many wars within colonies that were obviously just satellite wars between European countries. So, I mean, the specific reason why World War I started, it would be hard to find because, you know, there's the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. And so that part is kind of a bit more tricky in terms to determine why it started. But I think to more connect into in the subject that you were mentioning, I think one thing's for sure is that the Allied kind of really felt like they needed to show an example on Germany.
The result was violence. German workers had been killed in riots at Essen in March. Their funeral was turned into a vast demonstration of protest. Hatred grew. Germans began killing French soldiers, and at the funeral for one of them, tempers flared into acts of brutality. "1923 was disastrous for Germany. In that year, the great German inflation reached its peak. For some time, the value of the mark had been dropping, and as the value of the notes decreased, so the amount of notes needed to buy things grew. Banks became more and more hard-pressed to meet the ever-increasing demand for paper money. For their customers, suitcases replaced wallets. To meet this crisis and pay the strikers in the Ruhr, the government simply printed more money. And as it lost its value, so it cost more and more to pay wages, to buy food. Hundreds of thousands. Millions, whatever figure was printed on the notes, really meant nothing. The German mark was worthless. As in a fearful dream, people's life savings were blown away like leaves in a gale. As Germany slid towards disaster, Gustav Stresemann was appointed Chancellor. It was a time of crisis. The loss of production in the Ruhr was making inflation even worse, and Stresemann realized that the only way to help the economy back to normal was to call off resistance there and get production going again.
And whether it was just or not, whether Germany was an instigator or not, that's the part that I'm meaning it's irrelevant, is that the Allies won, they imposed their sanctions. Now, the sanctions were not really too severe. That's
technically it was started by Austro-Hungarian Empire. Technically,
but there was the assassination of Franz Ferdinand by the Serbian,
which was not small. Like it was a big deal. It was the way the heir to the throne, right?
Of course. Was it the spark? Absolutely. Was it the cause of World War I? Arguably. It was definitely a spark. And when it brings us to the Ruhr occupation, you know, that's when you start realizing the Ruhr occupation, it's a coal area where Germany had a very strong economic dependence on that coal area. And after that source of economy was taken away from Germany, it led to even more economic depression and naturally instability in Germany, which is kind of where you were mentioning about the rise of radicalism. In this kind of atmosphere, this kind of environment, radicalism kind of took the foot and led to what we know as Nazi Germany.
The government also announced that Germany would resume the payment of reparations. It was the only possible way of getting the French out. But to the nationalists, it looked like yet another pathetic surrender to Germany's enemies. General Ludendorff, who'd never accepted that Germany had been defeated, gave his support to Adolf Hitler, the leader of the new National Socialist Party. In Munich, the capital of Bavaria, They decided to try and overthrow the government. But Hitler's stormtroopers were not yet powerful enough and couldn't get the support of the army or the police. Their November uprising failed and merely ended in confusion and 14 deaths. Ludendorff and Hitler were put on trial for treason. Ludendorff was let off. Hitler was sent to prison, where he brooded on his failure for a few months in rather comfortable surroundings. Meanwhile, inflation was being brought under control. The old worthless money was called in and destroyed, and replaced by a new currency. At the same time, a committee under Charles Dawes, an American, was set up by the Allies to scale down the reparations so that Germany could afford to pay them.
So that's why I kind of feel like the interwars period, that period between 1918 and 1939, these 20 years are ones that if we really studied closely, we can really understand how World War II was able to happen. We forget that there's a bridge between World War I and World War II. You know, these 20 years are just a bridge, but they're very much connected. And I think it's interesting to see, you know, the psychology behind it, obviously. When a country is so damaged, when a country is so economically kind of anchored with the depression of the economy, how that can lead to any kind of radical government to take place. They say that a hungry person is the most dangerous person, which is, in this case, it was a hungry country. And that's where Nazi Germany was really able to take its stand.
The German leaders came to London in 1924 and agreed to accept the Dawes Plan. Stresemann's policy of cooperation began to pay off at that meeting. The French agreed to pull out of the Ruhr within a year. Their occupation had been unpopular with their most important allies, especially Britain, who'd refused to support their attempt to humiliate Germany. As German industry returned to normal after the chaos of occupation and inflation, Stresemann brought off another triumph, this time at Locarno in Switzerland. Under the Locarno Pact of 1925, France, Belgium and Germany agreed to respect the frontiers between them, and Britain said she'd support any country that was invaded. Old enmities seemed to be disappearing, and Germany no longer feared the threat of a French invasion.
The interesting thing is that we have quite a difficulty to understand what were the reasons for the actions back then. And it's hard to believe that you would be able to convince millions of people for 4 years to fight and die in despicable like conditions without clear explanation what they are doing there. Like you can force someone for some time, but not that much. So it means that probably the people that lived back then, they understood the reasons for what is happening better than we can. Mm-hmm. The Second World War is closer to us, and it's more probably clear to us what ideology was. But the First World War, we shouldn't forget that the governments were involved in this war. They were governed by the monarchs. Great Britain, well, the role of the monarch back then was more important, I would believe, than now. Russia, absolute monarchy. Germany, Austria-Hungary as well, monarchy. So the reasons for the wars back then could have been different. Like when you say that the assassination of the heir to the throne couldn't be the reason. And I believe, yes, it could, actually. Mm-hmm. Because it was run by the family. whose elder son was killed. And all of a sudden, Russia is mobilizing. When actually the Russia was supposed to say to Serbs, what are you doing, guys? We don't support you. You can't do these things. But Russia traditionally decided to step in on the side of the Serbs, as they usually did with all these region countries. So we might not understand because it was a different world. They shouldn't, like, when there was a monarch, they shouldn't have to be accountable to their nation too much. And like, it's not like modern presidents, and that might be the difference. And also the way people were treating their monarchies, they might have other reasons, like to die for our great monarch or whatever. And that's why we probably have this trying to explain it with economic reasons and things like that, but it could be just the different way of thinking back then.
And of course, there could be, it could definitely be that, but unfortunately, it would be too simplified to kind of say that, well, monarchy is the strongest element of a country, and that is enough for every country to join the war. And the reason also why I say why the assassination is not necessarily the cause, is more of the spark. It was also the speed of mobility for war. It was so quick that it can only have this seed of doubt in terms of, well, was that assassination really like just a spark that was waiting to light this barrel of oil? Maybe it could have been a different spark, but maybe there was a situation that was waiting for it to start. So that's why I say the spark and not the cause. I mean, undoubtedly, the alliances that were occurring at the time was also a huge reason. At the time you had the big countries, you had France and Britain, and you had these strong alliances between the strong imperial countries of the world that really teamed up together, which made that as soon as the assassination happened, many strong countries had to step in because the alliances. So, I mean, the alliances was one cause also. And that made that the war was never limited between two regions. They were actually limited to the whole world because of these alliances that put everyone together. So that could have been one cause as well, the alliances that occurred. The technology that happened also, the Industrial Revolution that was occurring.
Looks like they wanted to try the new technology.
Definitely.
They never tried before the airplanes. They never tried the gas attacks. Chemical weapons. They didn't try before the
World War I.
Tanks never tried. It looks like they all wanted just to check out maybe something changes with the technology, right?
And that's what I was referring to about imperialism. Ultimately you had all these strong countries that were flexing their muscles. Everybody was showing their weapons and their technology and all that. At some point, somebody needed to kind of step up. And I think that was a royal rumble between all these countries that were really trying to show their strength. They had to actually show it.
They all had the popular support. Like, people supported this. It was a huge wave of patriotism on both sides.
And that's why if we were to study the interwar years period, you'll see that many countries and the popular support that existed in World War I actually doesn't come back in World War II.
Finally, at Geneva in September 1926, Germany became a full member of the League of Nations. Aristide Briand, now Foreign Minister of France, welcomed Stresemann as an equal. It was all very friendly. By now, life in Germany appeared to be returning to normal. The Germans relaxed. The grim aftermath of the war, the humiliation of Versailles, the hysteria of 1923, all gradually faded beneath the surface of a new prosperity. For a defeated nation still paying for a lost war, the Germans appeared not to be doing badly. They could afford to live it up a little, have a good time.
World War II, France very early on was against the war, as opposed to World War I, where everybody was almost, to say, super supportive of the war. So you can see how psychology changed. People saw what happened. They saw the devastation. They saw the damages. And so World War II, a lot of people were a lot more reluctant to get into it, as was the US, as was many other countries that were witnessing it. Hence how Nazi Germany was able to kind of take Czechoslovakia, because countries were reluctant to get into a new war. World War I was traumatizing. You know, we had 40% of male population in France that died in World War I. This kind of psychology, it stays. It takes a lot more than 20 years to kind of get over. So I think that's the big difference between World War I and World War II. Now, for Nazi Germany, it was a different story. Germany was already at rock bottom. You know, it had nothing to lose at this point, except starting a new World War II. It had nothing to lose. It had been embarrassed so much, whether economically, politically, and all that the popular support wanted a new kind of change into the government, and radicalism was the answer to them. That's the only way of explaining it. If you were to take these same elements and take it in today's standard, you know, history repeats itself. The same thing can happen today, and the same thing can happen in the future, and the same thing has happened in the past. In a climate where the country is so depressed, radicalism could take its foot much more easily.
But now we are aware to this and trying not to support the situation when the country will, at least in Europe, I think. Well, we cannot make the generalization, because we can witness now how whole regions are falling into chaos, right? Mm-hmm. And probably even intentionally drawn into chaos, like in Northern Africa and the Middle East and the parts of Ukraine and so on and so on. But that's the intentionally thing, right? But when we try not to provoke someone, we try to help, like Soviet Russia. After the collapse of Soviet Union, obviously the world tried to make sure that Russia doesn't get radicalization, because they still possess the nuclear weapon, and were helping and giving lending money, sending humanitarian help. We all remember that. Mm-hmm. So they tried not to radicalize the area. So also it's a change because of the nuclear weapon, that actually we need to admit that already for 70 years, keeping the world in balance and preventing the world wars. We can't find any other reason why wouldn't anything like that happen, especially between Soviet Union and the United States of America, because the tensions were very, very, very high, and they were always on the brink of the war. So I also want to discuss with you in French some issues as a separate part. So I would like just to draw the conclusions to our short insight into this situation. What we can say is that the contemporary psychology of the leaders and of their people is playing the very significant role. And I believe that the most challenging is to submerge yourself into this psychology, even if you read their newspapers, even if as an historian, you you try to hop on to catch the time machine, because like old newspapers, it's like a time machine. You're like submerge yourself in the same time, right? And which I did a lot. I had a very big collection of old newspapers from the period between the wars and the war periods. And what I must say is that it doesn't really show enough of the taste of that time. We can read what they say, but it's hard to feel what they actually thought and how they felt. Another thing is that when they report the events, they usually report it in the same way we find them in the textbooks. Like if it happened yesterday and it's in the newspaper, and then you just compare, which I did, with the textbook, it's pretty much the same. I was thinking that, well, things are changing and I will find some interesting facts in the old newspapers that just slipped away from the textbooks. No. At the most part, it's just the same. If they said the reason was that and this, and what happened is that, then it's end up in the textbooks. That's another conclusion that we must say, that once the event have happened, for the most part, it gets recorded in the same way almost for eternity. I mean the factual things, like who did what. Of course, why can change. And what I would like to say that applying our psychology to the historic moments leads us to make mistakes. Psychology of people who were the leaders and their like nations, that's probably the most important part, and that's the most challenging part. With the Ruhr invasion, again, we can hardly understand why it was the reason back then, after the war, to insist that Germany would pay unthinkable retribution, which they were not able to pay, honestly. Mm-hmm. And why the decision was made to take over the region, which radicalized Germans against French even probably more than the loss in the war, because they were defeated, they were not allowed to have their army in significant numbers, and it's like an unarmed rival was attacked by French and Belgium, and not letting to use this region actually to probably it was made for the local and contemporary political reasons, internal reasons in France, just to show that they are tough and the Germans have to pay for what they have done. Because naturally, like you said, I never heard this number, 40% of males died in France in the First World War. That was the same families that were still in their like first 5-6 years after the war ended, like in 1918. It was 7 years, even less, 5 years. So they probably had to act that way. Otherwise, the French would say, look, you are not suitable to rule because Germans are not paying for what they have done.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, the wound was definitely fresh in the minds of the French, for sure. It was very fresh in their memory in terms of what happened. But one thing that it needs to be remembered is that the war was fought in many in foreign countries, meaning World War I was fought, a lot of it in France. I think the fact is that Germany had to pay for the damages that occurred in these countries. and the damages were so high, like France was not ready to pay for the territories that were damaged in their own countries. Everybody was going to send the bill to Germany. And it's a pretty logical conclusion. It's like, why would I repair what you broke? You broke it, you're paying it back. But unfortunately, everybody came in with their bill and everyone said, yeah, this is what you have to pay. And I think the Ruhr occupation was just one evidence where, well, you don't have enough money to pay, so we'll take this. This is a consequence of your inability to pay. So I think that part is very logical in terms of why the sanctions were so severe on Germany. It's logical. Germany destroyed, the war, where Germany was involved, destroyed a lot of area that needed to be paid back, and Germany got the short end of the stick and they had to pay it all back. And in terms of the local populations, you're absolutely right. The psychology of it is something that, obviously, as historians, this is not what we study. The psychology is for psychologists and history is for historians, but the psychology does add valuable kind of perspective into how people act at the time. And so that's definitely something that should, and I'm sure will eventually, but should be more studied, is the psychology behind these events, these historic events. That's a good part. There was one historian who tried to add this psychology to it, and he basically said that every era has a moral compass, and a moral compass during times of stability, it's very easy to see the direction that one should act. You should not kill, you should not steal. These are very easy in a society that everything is stable. But it's when a society is unstable, that moral compass is broken. What's right is maybe wrong. What's wrong could be right. So I think that's the psychology, that moral compass of humanity during periods of instability is something that is very fascinating to study.
Thank you very much. And next time we will discuss some more issues around the Second World War, since that's what you're specializing in. And it was very interesting. And